Sure.
Now, people talk about global warming and the
Hmm.
fact that somehow we are responsible for it. Now,
Yeah.
do you really think that Cro-Magnon man or Neanderthal man 20 to 25,000 years ago was responsible for melting the ice age? Does that sound reasonable to you? A bunch of cavemen with their campfires were causing global warming.
No, personally, I don't.
Okay. So, what makes you think that suddenly we're responsible now? In other words, the unbelievable power of nature to change our climate is somehow influenced by us puny little humans. And now, it's true that we have been bad. We have made pollution.
Correct.
We have changed our environment with our technologies. Okay?
Correct.
But is that even close to the power of an ice age? Is that even close to the power of the cycles of this planet, and which is directly connected to the cycles of this solar system and our sun? Absolutely not. In
Hmm.
fact, by many estimates, pollution in the developed countries has gone down.
Hmm.
In my own hometown here of Vancouver, I can remember vividly, and I have photographs to prove it, that this
Hmm.
city in the 1970s was
Hmm.
covered by a tarpaulin of smog
Hmm.
created by those gigantic V8 carbon belching monster cars with very little in the way of pollution control on them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it led to a a kind of a brownish haze enveloping the
Hmm.
city. And
Hmm.
we don't have that anymore. That's gone.
Hmm.
We have used technologies like catalytic converters and various other
Hmm.
things to reduce that.
Hmm.
Now that goes for just about every North American city, just about
That's
every
right.
European city,
That's right.
and many Asian cities.
Hmm.
And African cities, generally, do not even generate huge amounts of pollution because they don't have any technology at all,
Right.
or it's so limited that it doesn't, build up smog. When's the last time you saw
Right.
pollution and smog over, I don't know, Botswana? I don't think so.
Right.
In other words, where is the problem located? Well, they say it's in China and India. But China and India just in the last 15 or 20 years transitioned from coal burning to natural gas from Russia.
Hmm.
And I had some experience, for example, in South Korea, which used to be extremely polluted
Right.
in the late 1990s, but then started to transition to natural gas,
Sure.
cleaned the whole place up beautifully.
Right.
In other words, the actual evidence is not
Hmm.
there.
Yes.
Now they say, of course, global warming is happening. No doubt about that. But it's all our fault. Prove it. Prove it.
Well, it's a very complicated and a very wide subject where the accusers
Mm-hmm.
accusing humanities on the on planet Earth
Mm-hmm.
causing climate change, they are very narrow view. Let's just put it that way.
Yes.
The way I understand it is that they are their study, the area of studies that they pursue,
Mm-hmm.
and the research results are very narrow-minded. Let's just say that they don't represent the full picture.
Why would you do
Uh,
that? Is it because you want to uh, support a predetermined result?
uh, I'm leaning heavily towards that.
In other
Yes.
words, there's an agenda, and you're cherry picking certain data sets, and you're limiting certain knowledge in order to support your cherry picked, predetermined
Sure.
outcome. Now, that's not
Sure.
science. That's called propaganda.
That's not science. That's not science. I can tell you a couple of things
Mm-hmm.
that has been bothering me since I was young.
Mm-hmm.
You see, while I was growing up in Asian countries,
Mm-hmm.
in a pretty hot Asian countries in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
in my classes, social studies, they already started discussing things like, fossil fuel is a finite supply.
Right.
We are reaching the end of fossil fuel era. We
Mm-hmm.
have another 15 years of fossil fuel use before it becomes
Let
obsolete.
me guess. That was more than 15 years ago.
You bet. That was many, many decades ago. Okay. So, in the 70s, when I listened to that, I kept, you know, I, uh, I sort of have doubts, but of course, when you were at that tender age,
Mm-hmm.
absorbing information, absorbing
Yes.
things as the teachers and the
Yes.
classes teaches you,
Yes.
some people absorb them, take them in without thinking it over.
Do you think
For
that?
me, it has
Yeah.
always been very doubtful
Right.
because I'm a very observant person.
Right.
Once I've taken in certain information,
Mm-hmm.
it retains in my memory banks for many, many years.
Yes.
As we regularly retrieve them to revise,
Yes.
I realized that that so-called 15 years of deadline came and went.
Oh, so
But
you're
people are still
yeah.
using fossil fuel.
Uh-huh.
They're still pumping fossil fuel from underground.
Mm-hmm.
Fossil fuel automobiles are still running, and that was the 1980s.
Oh, you mean to tell me that the facts do not support the
Facts no longer
propaganda
support,
over the years?
and what I've learned in the
Uh-huh.
70s told me that, I began to doubt the what I've learned back then.
I agree with you completely because I heard the same story
Mhm.
when I was a teen and when I was in
Hmm.
my early
Fast
20s.
forward to right now, yes,
Yep.
you are
In fact,
indeed correct. The fact that
I even had the ideology drummed into me that there was only going to be a few years of automobile left, and that this car that I was driving as an 18-year-old might soon become obsolete, and because there wasn't going to be enough oil and gas, and
well,
or
this time
others.
around, instead of they using a passive nudging effect
Hmm.
of calling it climate change, the banning of use of fossil fuel,
Right.
very polluting and things like that. This time around, the political minions
Hmm.
are aggressively pushing and imposing a deadline, a timeline
Yes.
to completely ban fossil fuel
Okay.
automobiles and
So
the use
yeah.
of fossil fuels in general.
Okay. In other words, it's not global warming or a lack of petroleum products, be it coal, natural gas, or whatever. That's the problem. The problem is
Correct.
the politicians cutting off our ability to heat our homes,
That's
cutting
right. It's
off
just
our abilities
that's
to be mobile and do our
that's
jobs.
right.
In other words, there's an agenda here that has nothing to do with facts. It has to do with causing a artificial lack, an artificial
Correct.
deficit, and imposing all kinds of ridiculous
Correct.
environmental rules, carbon taxes,
That's
and
right.
pipeline shutdowns
That's
in order
right.
to create a crisis, which has nothing to do with a natural process at all. It's entirely to do with feeding the agenda of politicians and perhaps others behind the scenes that
That's
wish to
right.
control us, keep us in
Yes,
fear, and make us dependent upon them. Because
correct.
the point here is
It
that
has become extremely apparent during the last, I would say, a year and a half,
mhm,
where, say, for example, a lot of things happen to the countries in European Union. For
yes.
example,
Oh, is there something
you know,
today that's going on in Europe that might kind of
that's
resonate with
right.
what we're talking about?
That's That's right. For example, there was the supposedly war between Ukraine and
Uh
Russia
huh.
that leads to a lot of Western nations
Yeah.
boycotting the
Uh huh.
natural resource supplied by
Uh
that
huh.
big R
Uh
country.
huh. And why would they
And
do
the big
that?
R
Uh huh.
country actually, and as a consequence, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of European countries where they have been having long-term contract
Yes.
to obtain natural gas through pipeline to
Right.
supply their industrial usage for
Yes.
manufacturing to heating homes to anything else suddenly became a very tight contentious resource.
Okay. Sometimes on this channel we talk about esoteric and philosophical
That's right.
subjects, but today I'd like to talk about brass tacks. Brass tacks
Sure.
means fundamentals, and I'd
Hmm.
like to ask you if you agree or disagree with this statement. The sanctions and the cutoff of natural gas and energy supplies from Russia by the
Hmm.
European Union
Hmm.
has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with maintaining control over their own people.
Yes,
In
I
other,
believe
in
so.
other words, putting them in a situation where they lack the necessities of
That's
life
right.
forces them to turn to their
Hmm.
governments for support.
Hmm.
This is a sadistic and, you know, actually horrible. I'm not going to use other words. A horrible policy. In other words,
Hmm.
if you cause a need, then
Yes.
then if you can't supply that need, you have to look
Hmm.
outside of yourself. In other words, if you cut off energy supplies, and then you need to ask for that from outside, and if you can't provide it yourself. So if the average family in Europe can't heat their homes because of a
That's right.
government action, then they have to go back to that very same government that cut off their energy and
That,
plead and beg
yeah,
for sustenance.
that's
It's
right.
the most sadistic and perverse concept imaginable. It's
Well,
totally
and if you
abusive.
think that's, and if you crazy enough already, look no further, okay?
Hmm.
The best prime example I would say would
Hmm.
be the UK Prime Minister situations as of late.
Please
For example,
elaborate.
after after BJ's demise,
Yes.
um, there was briefly a female prime minister who came on board where she decided to approve
Yes.
UK for fracking energy like
Yes.
natural gas,
Hmm.
so as to help alleviate the looming energy
Hmm.
crisis that
Yeah.
UK is
Did
facing.
anybody explain what that fracking thing was all about? Did you see a full explanation of what fracking meant in context of the UK and natural resources self sufficiency? No, you didn't,
Hmm.
because the truth
Right.
is that Britain doesn't need to import energy. Britain
Hmm.
has massive coal reserves. In the
Hmm.
south of England, under the county of Kent, there's
Hmm.
actually liquid oil,
Hmm.
unbelievable amounts, quite large. So not only do they have liquid oil under Kent, and the reason they don't pump that up is because it's under the land of the gentry, of the nobles and the rich people, because Kent is the most prized and valuable real estate in England. In
Right.
other words, it's entirely to protect the ruling class. But in the
Sure.
Midlands, there's massive coal reserves because during the
That's
19th
right.
century, when they had the Industrial Revolution, places like Manchester,
Right.
which are in the Midlands, were industrial powerhouses because that's where the coal deposits are.
Right.
And under those coal deposits, you see, what fracking does is it fractures the levels or the strata, the stratum of rock to
Right.
release more
Release
petrochemicals,
limit. That's
right?
right.
So why would they have a fracking ban in the middle of an energy crisis?
Well, the best explanation I could think of, based on observations and common sense, is
Hmm.
that somebody wants full control over the situation. In
Somebody
other
wants
words,
more
they
energy
don't
crisis.
want you to have that energy.
They do not.
They
It's
don't want it to be available to you.
exactly. This has
That's
nothing to
why they want to
do.
control it. Simple as day.
Yes. In other words,
You
if
see
you.
the moment that female prime minister fallen
Mhm.
grace,
Yep.
it was promptly taken over by another Asian descent
Mm-hmm.
prime minister, which immediately he turned around and made a 180-degree turn and start banning fracking again. What gives?
Huh. What gives? Well, I'll tell you what gives. If your slaves are getting out of control, what do?
Right.
You cut off their
Oh,
food.
that's right. Let them starve.
And you know what they do? They beg forgiveness. Oh,
Right.
we will obey. We won't try to
Right.
escape. We'll work harder. Just give us more food. Because if you're a slave and if you're under their control, and if they're getting uppity, and if they're getting if they're actually beginning to look at the terms of their slavery and analyze them in terms of becoming free and perhaps taking out some pitchforks and going after their masters, then what you do
Sure.
is you tighten the screws even more. You
That's
make
right.
it even more difficult for them to live.
That's
And
right.
because you know why? Because slaves can't feed themselves, and slaves can't heat themselves. So if you can put even more pressure on them, then they'll stop rebelling and they'll start obeying, and that's what this is all about. And
Yes.
and people can't see that. They can't see that very simple concept.
Mhm.
Why? Why?
Well, because they have been conditioned to behave like a sheep for a long, 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 long time.
That's correct.
So much so that it's kind of like for generations, if you're a chicken raised in the chicken coop,
Yes.
you no longer know how to fly, even
We've-
though you're born with wings.
That's right. We've had talks about that.
That's right. So, but this time around, I sense that things are definitely different than in the past.
Yes.
Knowing full well that first there's this so-called man-made energy crisis
Yes.
imposed by boycotting natural gas supplies from
Completely.
Russia.
And we even had the pipeline blown up by agents unknown.
That's right. And to, the freshly elected UK Prime Minister suddenly turned 180 degrees and banned fracking once again,
Yes.
to all kinds of crazy things that would have a direct impact on common folks' everyday living. For
Okay.
example,
Yes.
about 6 months ago, there was a sudden change in tune, all in the name of climate change, where the Dutch politicians
Yes.
decide to raise the cost of nitrogen, which is a form of
Ooh.
fertilizer, to like 40%
Uh-huh.
in the name of climate change.
No, it's not in the name of climate change. It's in the name of oppression and total control.
Right.
Climate
It's all
change-
a matter of oppression and control.
Yes.
You bet.
And that's why
100%.
I want to return
But
to
they
the
use
yes.
that lame excuse to cover up their tracks.
In other words, you can't attack your government if they directly, if they are using a subterfuge, if they are
That's
using a cover story,
That's
a
right.
propaganda to hide the fact that they have a knife at your throat.
That's right.
And that's what the strategy. The strategy
That's
is to
right.
use things like climate change, or we don't like what Russia's doing in Ukraine, or some other excuse in order to keep their own people in check. And this is
Right.
a political method that's very
Yes.
well established in history.
That's
For example, Hitler used it with the Jews. You have an economic problem in Germany, blame the Jews. And use
That's
that
right.
as an excuse for war.
Correct.
And then as soon as we have war, we have total dictatorial control.
That's right.
Okay, so these are kind of the games that they play, the games that the elite rulers play, and Well, for example, there is no shortage of natural gas. There
Correct.
is no shortage of coal. There is no
Correct.
shortage of anything.
That's
What
right.
there is a shortage of is liberty.
Correct.
There's a shortage of democracy. That's the shortage. But no, you're not going to realize that because you're going to be thinking that there's a scapegoat, that it's Russia's fault, or that it's some sort of something that you can't even see. It's like a ghost. It's
That's
it's
right.
it's global warming's fault.
Yes, as
What?
always. And then they
What?
turn around and point fingers at us all of a sudden.
And you're all going to die in 30
Overnight. And
years because
so because of climate change, they made a lame excuse and blame
yes,
it on climate change and
yes,
suddenly raise nitrogen costs,
yes, and in fact,
imposing onto the
yes,
farmers in
yes,
many countries.
it's the most
But
sophisticated scapegoat of all.
we humankinds have been farming
Hmm.
for many, many millenniums,
Of course,
and
that's
many tens of
that's
thousands
our
of
human
years.
right to feed our
In
families.
fact, we have been using chemical fertilizers, which subjected to a lot of
Hmm.
debates. But nevertheless, we've been using chemical fertilizers to supplement the farming practice for
Yes,
over 150 years.
yes.
So why suddenly, or just overnight, a nitrogen induced climate change suddenly becomes a hot topic? Why does it capture such a big attention to the point where the politician has to
Hmm.
nearly overnight to impose some kind of restrictions or control over it,
Hmm.
all in the name of climate
Because
change?
it's a whip. It's a whip
It is a whip,
to control
okay? But
you, the slave.
a lot of people who's been enslaved for so long, they never realize that this is all a scam.
Yeah,
It's all
exactly.
about exerting additional political control because,
Yes.
the pollution doesn't just suddenly escalate overnight. We can
Of course
apply the
not.
same amount of fertilizers year after year,
Yes, and we've been
okay,
doing
into
it
the
since
farm,
1920.
okay?
And by the way,
That's
climate
right.
change is totally natural. And if our temperatures did go up, and if our ice started to melt, that would just
That's right.
raise the water levels. We would have less
That's right.
salinity. We would have more farmland in places like Canada, especially the north, and in
Right.
Russia, and agricultural production would
Right.
increase.
And then, of
And then we'd
course,
be
they
able to
would,
feed the world even more.
of
So
course.
what's the problem? Why
So
do they always look at the deficits of climate change instead of the benefits? Why don't they embrace climate change, which is happening as a natural process, as a wonderful benefit, as a
they
bonanza?
figure out to use this lame excuse to pull wools over our eyes
Hmm.
and to come up with more control mechanisms
Crack the
to
whip.
tightly keep us well under their control.
Exactly.
Okay? But here's the funny deal. First off, it is now known through better understandings of scientific research,
Yes.
which are the real ones, not the ones proposed by those politicians,
Yes.
that our global climate change are naturally caused and it's
Yes.
cyclical, meaning that
Absolutely.
the gradual heat up part, which keeps the overall global surface of the Earth temperature
Yes.
warmer than nominal,
Hmm.
may last 30, 50, or 70 years.
Yes.
And then it will switch over to another 30, 50, or 7 years of cooler than normal
There are
weather.
micro cycles within the macro.
That's right. That's right.
And the macro
So,
cycle is probably 15 to 20,000 years ice age, warming, ice age
correct,
again.
correct. And we've been living through these micro sites, like the cyclical
Yes,
alterations of temperatures, like you know,
yes. And there's
for
scientific
many for many
evidence for that.
many
You can
for
find
many
it.
many
Yeah, there's
generations.
scientific evidence for that. You can find that in things like
That's right.
2,000-year-old trees with
That's
the
right.
tree ring variations. You can find that
Correct.
in sedimentary deposits under the
That's
ocean
right.
floors. We're talking hard
That's right.
science here. We're not talking
Correct.
about a bunch of demonic propagandists cracking the whip on our societies, trying to generate fear and trying to generate panic, and even in our children in school.
Well, people who keep a keen eye on the cyclical changes have realized recently, as recent as within the past 2 years or so, the overall global temperature, the overall global climate
Yes.
has turned to cooler than usual, citing that in the
Cooler? I
past
thought we were having
two.
global warming. What the WEF is going on?
Well, hey, that's the so-called global warming is just what the politicians and the mainstream media wants to tell you.
Huh?
But are there any any objective, factual, scientific research to prove them?
Okay.
That is debatable,
Okay.
okay? Besides, one thing's for certain. I mean, during this past winter, the so-called polar ice cap has been rebuilt. It's gotten thicker.
Let's end on this note. Facts
Okay.
don't matter.
Mhm.
We're dealing with a situation where it's all about control. It's all about fear.
Yeah.
It's all about propaganda, and we are victims once again until
Of course.
we educate ourselves, use our discernment,
Correct.
and stand up for our freedoms.
Certainly.
Stop.
Awesome.